When I talk to some of you, and I've had similar conversations with others in the course of my ministry and just in the course of my life, I often get a question about how much of this Bible stuff, how much of this faith stuff are we really expected to believe? And what is it that turns people off from Christianity? What is it that turns people off from the faith, if not the prospect of having to violate your own rational brain, right? We're told to believe that a man walked on water. We're asked to believe that a bush was burning and not consumed. We're asked to believe that a woman conceived outside of the natural way of things. All of this seems to stretch our credulity, right? We get to a certain point in our life, usually right around the age when we're confirming children, and we say, this is all bunk, then we confirm them, and then send them off, and we hope to see them again, right? There's this sense that the faith is meant for children, that it's childish. And so when we come to a passage like today's gospel where Jesus says, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood in order to live, well, isn't that just another one of these silly or crazy or irrational propositions? And indeed, even at the time, it seemed like that to a number of his audience, a number of his listeners, and they began to dispute about it. I think for those of us who stick around, who stay with the faith, who stay with the church, maybe some of us come to this sort of settlement in our minds where we like the church, we like the people in it, we generally think that spirituality is a good thing, and so we rationalize it a bit. And maybe we say, okay, well, we've grown up. Our faith has matured. We know what to take seriously and what not to take seriously. And maybe we even sometimes look at St. Paul and that passage in 1 Corinthians when Paul says, when I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I put away the childish things. I put the ways of childhood behind me. And so maybe that's where we are in our faith. We've put away some of that supernatural nursery story stuff and stick with what's up in our head, with what we can know. But I want to say that that's not right. I'm going to challenge that. I'm going to say what the readings ask us to do today is to certainly have a mature faith, to grow in our faith, but not to confuse sophistication with maturity. One of the people that Paul was often arguing against were the very Greek sophists from which we get the word sophisticated. So he was arguing against having an over-rationalized faith. So how do we deal with it? How do we deal with those parts of the faith that are hard to explain? Well, one of the things we do is we believe. I think what Jesus shows us, what he shows us in the Gospels, is that it's more important to believe in him, to know who he is, to have a living relationship with him, than to explain him. There's a lot we can say about Jesus, and I spend my days reading about what to say to you about Jesus and then saying them on Sunday. But I hope I never get to the point where I've told you I've explained everything about him. The governing metaphor in today's gospel from John is one of eating and drinking. And like eating and drinking, believing is an everyday necessity. So what is the purpose behind this extended bread of life metaphor? If you've noticed, the Gospels for the last few weeks have been all about, a long section of John about Jesus saying he's the bread of life. The metaphor clearly causes confusion. John chapter 6, verse 52, then the Jews disputed among themselves, saying, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? Now, I don't have to tell you that it wasn't just the Jews of his time and many of his disciples who disputed the meaning of these words. This is probably the biggest division between Protestants and Catholics. What do the meanings of these words mean? What is the meaning of these words, and what is it that happens during the Lord's Supper, the sacrament of Holy Communion? So successive generations of Christians have certainly disputed these words of Jesus. Now, I'll tell you, speaking as someone firmly anchored in the Reformed tradition, although I think they can be reconciled with the Catholic tradition, I'll tell you two things I think Jesus did not mean. It does not mean a kind of cannibalism, which is what Christians were accused of back in the day. The Roman pagans accused Christians of cannibalism. And even though there really is a human sacrifice at the heart of Christianity, the way that human sacrifice was part of many pagan religions, this is not to suggest for a moment that Christianity is some kind of imitation of paganism. There's a perspective about the evolution of religion that says, well, there's this idea that the seed goes into the ground and that it dies there and it gives new life, and Jesus even uses that image, and that the life and death cycle that continues, that we see annually in the seasons, that's the inspiration for the resurrection story, and not just the resurrection story, but for all the religions that have a life-death cycle, a dying God, a rising God. Well, that's to just say that Christianity took its cues from the stuff of man-made religion, and I don't believe that, and I don't think that's what this passage is saying either. We may share something about this idea of sacrifice in common with pagan religions, but Christianity is not just a dressed-up version of paganism. If anything, the pagan religions grasp dimly at the truth that some kind of sacrifice is necessary for life. And theirs is a pale copy of what Jesus comes to reveal in living flesh and blood. The second thing that I think Jesus' words do not mean, so they do not mean cannibalism, they do not mean that you can somehow get right with God through eating some sort of mystical supper. The heart of the gospel is not about what you do for God, but what God does for us. That's what grace is. And we appropriate that grace through faith by trusting in God. So we cannot say that it's a good work to come to church and eat the bread and the wine, and that somehow you've now put God in your debt, right? Now God owes you life. That's not what this is about. That's not what this is saying. When we think about the sacrament of the Lord's Supper in that way, or even when we just think about religion in general, of coming to church, of praying, of doing our religious duty, when we think of it in a transactional way, that's to put God in our debt. That's kind of a vending machine vision of God. I put the quarter in, I demand payment for the lollipop or the soda pop or whatever. I guess it's $1.75 now or whatever it is. It leads to an economic or a transactional view of religion or of the sacrament. Or it leads to a superstitious view of the sacrament. And it leads to a dependency on ritual. Now think about it. If your ability to be saved, if your ability to get right with God, or to say if God's love were somehow dependent on this building, or on you being here, or on me standing here, or on you eating the bread that comes from that altar. Think about that for a second. If that was quite literally the means for you to live, like maybe an IV hooked up to a person who's dehydrated and starving, how much power would that give me? How much power would that give the church? A lot. And frankly, many preachers, many priests in many churches have behaved as if they are the guardians and the gatekeepers of the way of life. So too much dependency, too much thinking of the ritual as the means for getting right with God, as the means for saving yourself, puts all the power in all the wrong places, in men, in institutions, in priesthoods. And that is the second thing that Jesus is saying absolutely no to. Because he had an apparatus like that in Jerusalem. It was called the temple. He knew what that was like. So we have two options here. We have the cannibalism of paganism on one side, which I'm sure none of you want to go back to. But we also have the institutionalism that the church can turn into. And that we are always in danger of being entrapped by. God is asking us to have a mature faith, a faith that sees both of those as errors, a faith that says no to magical and superstitious thinking, but a faith that also stands up against being dominated by a powerful institution. So what could Jesus possibly mean? Is there a way that the Christian can say truly that he lives by eating Christ's body and drinking his blood? Well, I think there is, and I'll talk about that. But first I need to talk about why it is we get into disputes. Why did the Jews in the gospel today start disputing? Why do many of Jesus' disciples hear these words and leave him? Why do Christians dispute over these words? Well, think about why we get into arguments. I think we get into arguments to prove ourselves right? Because there's some layer of doubt, there's some level of doubt about what's happening, what's going on. There's something we don't understand, so we try to explain it away. We've lived through 18 months now of a pandemic where lots of people have lots of different explanations, and we're disputing with each other, and we're tearing ourselves apart over this. And are we getting anywhere? I don't think so. I think we're falling back. We're falling back into confusion. Explanations multiply when there's doubt. To crib St. Paul, where doubt abounds, explanations abound all the more. But Jesus isn't asking us to explain him. He's asking us to put our faith in him. But what do we do with that faith? What's one of the first things our faith tells us? Our faith tells us that we're made in the image of God, that we are his beloved creatures. One of the reasons I love the morning prayer service that we do here is we sing the Venite at the beginning, which is a wonderful hymn to our createdness, a wonderful hymn to our creatureliness, and of course, it's a wonderful hymn to the Creator who made us. But we spend a lot of time trying to explain away that Creator. We're okay with the idea we're made in the image of God. That sounds good to us. But we don't necessarily like so much the idea that this God creates us and that we have obligations to fulfill toward him. And so smart people dispute and explain God away. They try to explain what being is. How could there be? What is being? What is thought? What is knowledge? The great question of the last 200 years in epistemology was, can knowledge even be known? Is it possible to know anything at all? Modern epistemology, which is to say modern theories of how we know what we know, started with Descartes saying, I think, therefore I am. He tried to say we don't actually need the creator. The creature is sufficient. He is sufficient by proving that he can think for himself. Well, that led to all kinds of disputes and explanations, and we ended up with critical theories of the day that destroy even the very idea of a creature. Deconstruction basically says you don't even need the creature anymore, or you can't prove the creature. So where does that leave us? Doubt multiplying upon doubt and explanations upon explanations. David mentioned the wisdom books. I think the Wisdom of Solomon in the Apocrypha has one of my favorite lines. Of the writing of books, there is no end. So this begs the question, then, why would Jesus use such a convoluted metaphor if he knew it would just get us into more arguments? And I think it's the same reason that he used parables. If you remember, a few weeks ago I preached about why he used parables, and he says himself why he uses parables. It's to separate the insiders and the outsiders. It's to separate the ones who know him and believe in him from those who are only out to get him. It's a kind of a code language. And so here again, I think, is another parable unfolding in the Gospel of John, except this time Jesus is living this parable out. And he's invited all of us to continue to live this parable out in our worship of him from week to week, month to month, when we come and celebrate the Lord's Supper. He's inviting us to live this parable, to act it out as a kind of drama, a kind of tableau. And of course, that's what it's for. the Holy Communion, the worship and the praise of God, are for those who who need not to explain God, but who love him and put their faith in him. So what does Jesus mean when he says in John chapter 6, verse 53, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you? Well, he means that he will sacrifice his body for the sake of the world. That's another one of those things that we ask you in the church to put your faith in. Virgin birth, walking on water, God creating the earth, all of the miracles, parting of the Red Sea. Well, here's the greatest one of them all, that this man's death is somehow your life. The bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. Now again, that doesn't mean to cut Jesus up into 1,000 pieces and eat him. And it doesn't mean that through the magic of my fingers, that bread turns into flesh. Again, I think I could have a conversation with a Roman Catholic and make it all square away. I don't think the conflict is as severe as you might think it is, but it doesn't mean put your faith in the institutional authority of the church. It means exactly what he says it means. It means that his flesh is the life of the world. That is a mystery that is known better to God than to us this side of the veil. We will never really understand how, but that's what we're asked to put our faith in. This might make a little bit more sense if you consider the fact that because of sin, the human race is destined to die out. Now, I would preach and say things like that. It hasn't happened here yet, but in my old church, I'd say stuff like that, and people would say, well, I like your sermons. They make me think, but you're kind of negative, right? The whole human race is going to die out, sin. Well, okay, the preacher's job is to deal with sin, so I got to deal with it. But this past week I heard a lot of panic in people's voices. The lead article in the New York Times I think it was on Monday, was this new report on climate change, right? The Delta variant. Am I the one being negative, or are the headlines screaming that we're all about to die out? But I hear real panic. But I don't think that Jesus, and I'm really only trying to speak his words after him, is negative. He's dealing with sin, but he's giving us a word of hope. He's saying that his flesh is the life of the world. So here it is. This is the gospel. If you want to escape the grim destiny that we all face, then believe this. Believe what this man says. So Jesus uses the food metaphor. He uses it on purpose, and it's to show us what to do, how are we to live going forward. Because Jesus is offering us a different destiny. We don't have to die out. And so he's borrowing a symbol from that which keeps this life going, which is bread and blood. He's using that symbol and he's carrying it forward into the next life, into the new life. Just as we need daily physical bread in this life, we need the bread of faith to live in the next life. And so just as we don't even have to remind ourselves, really, to eat our bread and drink our water every day, we need to recommit to that faith, to that life of faith every day. It needs to be a daily occurrence. It needs to be a daily diet. That's how we mature in the faith. Just like when we're young and we eat good food and we grow, when we appropriate God's grace through our faith, we grow, we mature in faith. As Paul says, we grow to the measure of the full stature of Christ. And what happens? More and more, that destiny of extinction becomes a wrong turn in our rearview mirror that we don't have to take. And the purpose of our lives is the road ahead of us now. It becomes clear, and our wills align with God's will, in the same way that when you're driving, you turn your wheels to align with the road, because when you don't, really bad things happen. That's all it means to obey God's will, to go in the direction that he would guide us in. And yet I know there's doubt, and I know doubt remains, and I struggle with doubt. And so I read books, and I try to explain it better to you, and I try to understand it better myself. But there's a point that I reach where the mind just is exhausted and gives up. And so what do I do then? I do what St. Paul says in the reading from Ephesians today. I grab my hymnal and I sing. Sometimes I just sing in my head. Sometimes I put on Spotify and those noise-canceling earphones and play hymns. You can get every English cathedral choir singing every hymn you ever wanted. And I'll sing along or I'll listen to them. Because what am I doing then when I sing? I'm praying, but I'm also praising. I'm praising God. And praise is the shape of faith. Praise is the sound of faith. Praise is the appropriation of that faith. It's making it our own. It's what we'll do for eternity. It's what we'll do for eternity, singing praises to God the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. And I'm not sure even then we will fully get to the bottom of the mystery of God. But we can always praise him. Amen.